We're here today with Steve Novak, a veteran of World War II, here in our U.S. history class. And I want to ask Steve a few questions about his experiences back in the days prior to World War II. Now, Steve, I understand you didn't enlist in the service till after Pearl Harbor. Now, what was the year that you actually went in?
1943.
So it was in 1943.
Yes.
Now, obviously, Pearl Harbor woke up a lot of Americans to the danger that was going on. Now, do you remember that particular day?
Yes, I do. And the thing I'd like to stress is how many boys enlisted real fast in the town of Holden. At high school, when I was at high school, I bet a third of the kids at high school went down and enlisted right away.
So there was a lot of patriotism right after Pearl Harbor.
Right.
And a lot of people were pretty aggravated with the Japanese, I'm sure.
Yes. Yeah.
Now, how old were you when you first decided you wanted to go into the service, Steve?
When I was 16, I went down and tried to enlist in the Navy, and they caught me. They told me go home and grow up. So when I turned 17, I had changed my mind to enlist in the Marine Corps, which I did. And they took me as fast as they could.
So you went in at 17 years old. Now, where did you do your basic training, Steve?
Paris Island, which if you want a good learning experience, if you're being trouble to mother and father, join the Marine Corps and get down to Paris Island. They'll straighten you out fast.
So they whipped you into shape. Now, where did you go after Paris Island, Steve?
I was very fortunate. I was chosen to attend C School in Portsmouth, Virginia. And I attended school, I don't know, 3 or 4 months. And then they asked for volunteers. That's where they sent out Marines to all the ships that had Marines based on them. And
So you actually were assigned to work with the Navy aboard a Navy ship?
right. They asked for volunteers, and I wish you could have seen, we had a class the size of this. Every Marine ran up to volunteer to go out to see what the war was like. I'd like to say this to you. Don't volunteer for anything in life unless you know what you're volunteering for.
Now, did you feel as if you knew what you were volunteering for at that time?
Well, we're all in the same boat. We're volunteering to win the war.
Well, there was no doubt that World War II was a justifiable war. There wasn't any question about that. Now, how did you end up on the Franklin? Was that the first ship you served on, Steve?
Yes, that's the only ship I served on, yeah.
So you were assigned to serve on the USS Franklin. Now, was your first mission into the Pacific?
Right. Our planes bombed all the islands that we're involved with, where the Japs were. So we've seen a lot of action. The Japanese were after carriers because we carried 100 planes. You can imagine that's more than the Worcester Airport has seen in the past 10 years. So 100 planes they wanted to destroy.
Now, what was the year that the Franklin was on that fateful mission that they headed for the Japanese coast? Was that 44?
44, yes. We had 1,200 ships. Now, you can't imagine 1,200 ships. They weren't close. They were 200 miles apart, 100 miles apart, and we were going up, or the ship was going up to bomb the homeland of Japan. And when we were 20 miles away, we were struck by a Japanese plane coming in on close to the water. Radar would not pick up a plane, say 4 or 5 feet above the water. They snuck in and dropped 2 bombs on us, which we self-destructed. We had 100 planes loaded with the bombs. We had a new Tiny Tim bomb was being used the first time, and it was a perfect hit.
Now, had you been hit before that, your particular ship?
Yes, we were hit on October 30th, 44. We were hit by a suicide plane. The suicide plane hit a 5-inch gun turret, which is a big object, and I was standing from here to the corner of the room. I was very fortunate I wasn't struck by the flash of the bombs going off and the gas. There was a sailor standing up 4 feet higher than I was. I was on a gun platform. He was on a flight deck. And with the flash of the bomb, burnt all his clothes right off of him. You can't imagine how powerful this is. We had a medical box right there, so I took morphine and I injected him a couple of times, but the boy died shortly. He never survived.
Now, how many do you figure were killed in that first attack, the kamikaze attack?
36, I think there were.
So you survived that, and you kept heading for the Japanese coast. So you were only 20 miles off the coast when the, you say a surface bomber, a plane along the surface dropped 2 huge bombs.
Right. 2 500-pounders, I think they were.
Now, when your ship was hit, Steve, I know it was hit very badly. I understand that many of the men were trapped below deck on the Franklin. That was the ship you were assigned to. Now, what kind of action did you take then?
Well, I was 18 years old. Most of the boys aboard the Franklin were 18, 19, 20 years old. And we were hit at a bad time. We were hit at 7 o'clock in the morning, which meant that half the crew was down eating. And we had 2 or 3 mess halls, and I was trapped in a mess hall with about 400 people, 400 boys.
So you were below deck when the bombs hit then?
We were 3 floors below deck, below the hangar deck.
Now, what was it? Did you hear a tremendous roar when the bombs?
Oh, yes, and this ship was the length of 3 football fields, and it rattled like a pair of dice. You would never believe how it just shook, and you knew something was radically wrong. And we hoped it wasn't a submarine that sent a missile into us.
So a torpedo was your concern.
Yes.
Now, how soon after that did it get very dark on board and smoky, and was that almost instant? Or
Immediately, yeah.
Now, how did you find your way out of the place 3-story?
Well, the first thing was to control everybody. 400 people to control by an 18-year-old. I never got over it to this day. I shouted at him because everybody wanted to rush for the doors. And aboard the ship, you have watertight doors that you got to seal as soon as something is wrong. In case water is pouring in, it won't pour into everywhere. So I shouted at the men to sit down, don't get excited, we're going to run out of oxygen before anything else happens. I says, if you want to survive, you got to keep calm, and we don't use up our oxygen too fast, which they followed directions well.
No, at some point you figured you better lead these guys out of there.
In a short while after they quieted down, which they did listen well, I told them that I was on the Franklin, I don't know, a year or 2 before that, and I knew the ship pretty well. I told them that I was going to go out and see if I could find my way out, and if I did, I'd be back. I kept leaving, and I'd probably go out 10, 30 feet, or maybe 10 yards, and I'd have to come back to breathe air. The place was filled with smoke and darkness. And I did this a number of times until I found a way out. I came back, and I told the men I got a way out.
Now, before you went back, now you got to the deck of the ship, so you saw blue sky.
Not to the deck, but out close to it where I knew where I was. You know.
Now, weren't you tempted just to get up on deck and save yourself and not go back?
I was halfway there, you know, so.
Now, let's pause for a second, because I want to get a look at the map so you can show us where you were at the time that this happened. So here you are, Steve, you're 18 years old, you're in charge of somehow getting all those men off the ship or up above on deck. Now, you were saying you had no feeling that you better get yourself out of there and not worry about the rest of them.
No, I didn't. I went back, and of course, when I told them that I got a way out, again, they rose to their feet and they want to rush for the door. And I told them that we won't make it that way. You got to line up peaceful and quiet, hold on to one another's belt, and hold on tight so you don't lose anybody, and we'll make it.
So you made it up onto the deck eventually.
Yes.
Now, how many men do you figure you led to safety on that particular?
They say about 400. No.
Who probably wouldn't have made it up without your help.
Oh, I'm sure they wouldn't have.
Now, what was it like on deck at that time? Was everything pretty much on fire? And
Oh, yes. The flight deck was half burnt, big holes in it. We had a big elevator the size of this room that they hauled the planes up and down. And the concussion of the bombs going off threw this big elevator up in the air about 10 feet, they said, and then it dropped back into the hole. Yes.
so now, once you got on deck and everyone was, well, you figured out how many people had survived. How many do you figure had died in the initial attack?
We, like I said, we were feeding at the time, and there were two lines on the hangar deck where they stored the planes. And they had, on each side, they had where the sailors would go down. And these poor boys who were standing on a hangar deck, our own planes, we had probably 40 planes on the hangar deck that were on fire, the bombs going off, and we lost 1,000 boys in an hour. And it was a miserable death because they all died from being cooked alive from the flashes of the bombs and the gas.
So you figure 1,000 men died in the first hour or so. How many men were on board the ship total, Steve, approximately?
We had 3,500 sailors and 72 Marines aboard the Franklin.
Now, once you basically took a toll on what had happened, was there concern that the Japanese would come back? That must have been a big concern.
Oh, yes. Planes came back continually to try to sink the Franklin, but thank God that there was a lot of ships around, and planes from other carriers would go after these planes, and it's really give them the business.
Now, was there any consideration about maybe abandoning ship at that point?
No, there wasn't. And we had a ship, we were tilted like this, and they were afraid that the Franklin was going to roll over into the water. We had so much water that was poured onto the Franklin from other ships that they were frightened that we were going to roll over.
So they were shooting water on the fires, in other words, trying to put the
Right.
fires out. Now, I understand, too, you had lost power and you were drifting closer to the Japanese coast.
We lost power for a couple of days, yeah.
Now, how close did you get to Japan before you finally realized?
20 miles off the coast of Japan.
So you're only 20
And I'm a
miles.
lousy swimmer, believe me. I didn't want to go in the water.
Now, at some point, you got power back.
Our engineers got power back, and we went back to an island called Anahuac, which was a base for our ships. And this base had screens underwater so a submarine could not sneak into it. We there, and we got some, I don't know what food or what. And then we started off for Hawaii. And
So it was a slow trip back to Hawaii then, it must have been.
yes, it was.
Now, when you arrived in Hawaii, I assume they did more repairs, and then it was decided that you'd take the Franklin back to the West Coast?
Yes, but before we get there, the captain was working us to death. We worked long hours, doing miserable work, trying to identify these sailors that were all dead, 1,000. And we were all exhausted, really. So I got the job, they were going to rebuild the captain's quarters from the island structure to the forecastle deck. So I went up on a forecastle deck, or they put me on a forecastle deck to make sure that everything was all right, nobody was stealing anything out of those cabins up there. And the captain's big leather chair was already brought down to his new quarters. And before my fanny hit that chair, my eyes were closed and I was sound asleep. And guess who came in to check his new quarters? The captain and the Marine orderly. The Marine orderly was Klemkowitz. Captain had a Marine with him all the time. We were underway.
So you were sleeping in the captain's chair. Now, what rank were you, Steve?
I was a private at the time.
You were a private in the captain's chair. Now, what did he think of that?
Arrest that man! So, of course, Klemkowitz and I were as close as you kids are, you know. And, of course, he took me down to the Marine Major and they put me under arrest. So now the rumor started that Novak is going to be shipped to land with a crew in Japan, which would mean instant death, really, because the Japanese were very clever. They had holes everywhere. So, of course, as time went on, this rumor kept going that when we get to Hawaii, Novak would be gone too. But one of the orderlies came up to me and I couldn't do anything while I was under arrest. I just could sit around and talk with whoever would talk with me. And they said they wanted you down in Marine Major's office. I went down there and they had more brass, they had an admiral there, they had commanders, they had everything. And I walked in and the Marine Major spoke for me. And I didn't know what was going to happen. So anyway, what happened was they gave me a warning. And I did not know I was recommended for a medal. And the medal was the highest medal given by the Navy and the Marine Corps, a Navy Cross. So they mentioned at the time that I was recommended for the medal, but not at this particular time. And they gave me corporal stripes, which I was amazed with. I just couldn't believe.
That must have been a big shock, thinking you were arrested and now you're getting promoted and you're winning a medal. So it must have been a good feeling when you left there.
So when we came back, we're going to go through the Panama Canal, and we were one day out, and the president died. And
So by this time it was March of 1945. And what was the feeling on the ship when they found out that Roosevelt had died?
well, a lot of sympathy, you know. The men thought the world of them.
But by that time, now, it was right around the time that Germany was on the run. You must have put the war in Germany was just about over.
Over, yeah. Yeah.
Now the Franklin went through the Panama Canal.
And we come, oh, I got to tell you this. We were 72 Marines, and somebody stole a dog in Hawaii. We brought him back to New York. And everybody laughed, and they said that as soon as the dog hit Brooklyn, he says, "Where's Broadway? Where's Broadway?"
So you got the dog. Now who ended up with the dog, Steve?
Somebody, he disappeared right away. Somebody stole him from us. Yeah.
So he had been on the Franklin. He was one of the survivors of the Franklin then, that dog.
Right, yeah.
Now, so where did you end up taking the ship? Into dry dock?
In Brooklyn.
So it was in New York.
In New York, yeah.
Now what did they do with you then? By this time it was spring of 45. The war wasn't over at that point.
Well, they put the crew into condos on Myrtle Ave in Brooklyn. And then the war ended, you know, Germany surrendered, and the bombs, the atomic bombs were dropped, and our war ended. So they
Now what was the feeling toward the bomb now? It must have been
as happy as could be.
So was there any question back then about whether it was proper to have used nuclear weapons?
Amongst the men, it was the best thing that President Truman did. Yeah.
Now, do you think your crew might have been part of a Japanese invasion if, in fact, they hadn't used the bomb?
Well, if we didn't drop the bomb and we landed, our troops landed in Japan, we'd have taken an awful beating, awful beating. Those troops would never survive.
So there have been a lot more Americans killed. So there was no question that you supported the use of nuclear weapons back then.
Oh, God, yes. Everybody did. Yeah.
Well, it must have been very exciting when the war came to such a quick end. Now, at that point, you came back to Holden?
Yeah. We were sent to Bainbridge, Maryland for discharge. And we were home. I was home in October.
Now, were you sent home by train? Did you arrive at Union Station?
Yeah.
Now, what was the mood when you arrived? Were there a lot of people there to greet the train?
There were people, yeah, because they were bringing troops back all the time. As you'll see in the movie, when we pulled into Brooklyn, New York, people cheering galore, you know, because everything was pretty quiet by that time.
Well, people certainly did appreciate what you had done during the war.
Yeah.
Those were amazing years. So after that, I know you were married. You had at least a couple children.
I was married before.
Oh, you were married during the war.
I got married after the suicide plane hit. I went home, I borrowed $25 because I didn't have money to come home from Seattle, Washington. Come home and got married like a fool. Can you imagine getting married with no money at all? But madly in love.
Now you came back, and now when did you start in the Holden Police Department? Was that your first job once you got back?
No, I booted around, you know. But I got on the police department in 1950, I think. You know,
And what year did you retire?
25 years ago.
So you served from 1950 till, if my math's correct,
85, I think it was.
so 35 years in the Holden Police Department.
Well, and I want to tell you kids, I worked here at Wachusett too. I did the truancy work for Wachusett School District. I used to visit a lot of homes, pick kids up down in the cemetery behind Herb's Restaurant, down under the bridge at the railroad tracks.
So that was your job for a number of years.
Yeah.
And to go back over your war service now, so you ended up winning the Distinguished Naval Cross, was it?
Yeah. That's the highest medal given by the Navy and the Marine Corps.
And what was your rank when you ended as a corporal?
Corporal.
Well, we appreciate your service, Steve. You did a terrific job, and I don't know where we'd be without the people who fought and won World War II for us. So I thank you for being with us today.
It's a pleasure.
On the eve of the Allied invasion of Okinawa, Japan was entering the final phase of their desperate air strategy against British and American warships. Scores of young kamikaze pilots took to the skies on one-way missions, destroying all in their paths, including themselves. Flying from Kagoshimi's Kokubu airfield on Kyushu are 8 Japanese D-4Y-3 Judy dive bombers. Using the low cloud ceiling as cover, they speed toward the American fleet just a short distance from the mainland. Shackled to the bomb rack of each attacker is a single 1,000-pound bomb. And on this overcast March morning, one American ship looms larger on the horizon than the others. Maneuvering just 50 miles off Kyushu, Preparing for the invasion of Okinawa is the carrier USS Franklin, the flagship of Task Group 58.2. The task group had ventured closer to the Imperial mainland than any previous American strike force, an opportunity the enemy could not resist. The Franklin and her crew were about to have their mettle tested in ways they never imagined. The Essex-class aircraft carrier, pride of the U.S. Navy, was designed to spearhead the American offensive in the Pacific and carry the weight of naval air power to the Japanese.
Wow. It was the biggest thing I'd ever seen. I actually thought that nobody would dare to attack anything that big. I felt so safe.
I really thought that I was on the safest ship in the world because we had all the destroyers and other ships around us. The only thing that I didn't stop and think about was that that was the ship that the Japanese wanted the most.
Another giant aircraft carrier joins the American Navy. Commander McAfee, head of the Women's Naval Auxiliary Forces, swings the champagne as she christens the new ship Franklin.
As one of America's most modern wartime carriers, Franklin was commissioned on 31 January 1944 and built in the record time of just 10 months. She was the 6th American warship to bear the name Franklin. Men who served aboard Franklin from her commissioning were called plank owners.
I was a plank owner. I came aboard in January of '43. Plank owner is a person who is on a ship when they initially commission it. And that was quite a ceremony, as I remember. We had a lot of high officers around, and that was quite an operation, really.
Her carrier Air Group 13 consisted of approximately 100 aircraft, Grumman Hellcat fighters, Grumman Avenger torpedo bombers, and Curtiss SB-2C Helldiver dive bombers. After completing a shakedown cruise to Trinidad, Franklin sailed through the Panama Canal and arrived at Hawaii on 5 June 1944. Her skipper, 48-year-old Captain James M. Shoemaker, was former commanding officer of the Pearl Harbor Naval Air Station during the 7 December 1941 attack. He was known to the men to be tough, but fair.
He was tough. He got what he wanted, but the man was fair. He was a real decent person.
Shoemaker was a real seagoing good skipper. I won't be able to say that for the other fellow.
Attached to Task Force 58.2 of the 5th Fleet under Vice Admiral Raymond Spruance, Franklin saw her first combat operations in early July with sortie carrier strikes against Iwo Jima, Guam, and Rota Island. That was designed to soften up defenses for the subsequent ground assault of the Marianas.
I enjoyed my time truly on the Franklin, and good men, good ship.
In September 1944, the Franklin became the flagship of Task Group 38.4, commanded by Rear Admiral Davidson, and supported the invasion of Peleliu and Angaur Islands in the Palaus. crossed the equator on 20 September 1944.
If I live to be 1,000, I'll never forget crossing the equator. Punishment was pretty bad. Sick bay was kind of filled with people that get hurt kind of bad. They actually took down the American flag and run up the Jolly Roger. And rank had nothing to do with this thing here. If the skipper wasn't a shellback, he was treated just like the rest of the people out there, as many of the officers found out. They found that there was no such thing as officer's privilege when you're crossing over there.
The first time you cross the line, you get paddle line, you get to eat trash or whatever they can do to you. It's a fun time for everybody. Everybody gets to have their day.
On the evening of 13 October 1944, while cruising off Formosa, Franklin was attacked by 4 Betty torpedo bombers. Captain Shoemaker dodged 2 torpedoes, and all 4 Betty bombers were shot down. But one Betty bomber, approaching Franklin from the port side amidships and hit by Franklin's gunners and on fire, slid across the carrier's flight deck and crashed into the sea to starboard.
It was coming wide open, that torpedo plane, and it waited too long to drop that torpedo. It just barely cleared to where it would go over the flight deck, but it evidently had one wing just a tiny bit low, and it tipped the end of that gun barrel and spun out across the flight deck.
The longer we got on there, the more I realized it wasn't a place to try to make a living. It was a job, and it was a tough job. We had a good bunch of gunners on that ship. A lot of Marines. They could shoot.
In late October 1944, the Franklin successfully took part in what came to be known as the Battle of Leyte Gulf. For 5 days, the planes of Admiral Bull Halsey's Task Force 38 and Franklin's own carrier air group rained bombs down on the Japanese fleet. Scores of enemy ships were damaged or sunk, including the 72,000-ton Musashi, sister ship to Yamato, one of the heaviest and most powerfully armed battleships in history. In the end, some 24 enemy warships with more than 10,000 Japanese officers and men aboard were at the bottom of the Pacific. Leyte was a resounding defeat for the Japanese, a defeat from which the Imperial Japanese Navy never recovered.
Well done is an expression that you cannot do better. And as far as the Navy is concerned, best thing they can say to you is well done. And Captain Shoemaker got on the horn and he said, "Men, well done. We have just been through the biggest naval battle ever fought. Well done to the Franklin crew. Tonight, we're going to have chocolate sauce on our pudding." He could hear guys roaring with laughter clear to Times Square, you know. But thinking about it, what else could he offer? He offered his thanks to the ship and recognized the ship. But that was a Shoemaker, and he was a good guy.
On 30 October 1944, while sailing off Samar Island in the Philippines, Franklin became the prime target of the Kamikaze Special Attack Corps. 3 Japanese Zeeks and 3 Judy dive bombers lifted off from an airfield on Cebu to attack Franklin and her escorts. Franklin's gunners and those aboard supporting vessels splashed 4 of the attackers. The 1 Zeke crashed into the carrier USS Belleau Wood. It killed or wounded 92 officers and men. A 2nd Zeke, hit by Franklin's gunners and burning, slammed into Franklin's flight deck right next to number 7 5-inch 38 plane.
I was on the radio with the gunners, and I could hear a gunnery officer say, "Don't shoot, it's an F-6F." some guy from, had to be down south. He said, "What you doing with them big red meatballs?" And about 2 seconds later, we got hit. And that was it. We lost over 50 men, I think, that day.
I was very young and naive, and I couldn't believe how the sailors ran up and pulled anything off that Jap plane or the Jap for a souvenir. I was just all eyes. I couldn't get over that.
When the smoke cleared, 33 of Franklin's aircraft were destroyed or damaged so badly they had to be pushed overboard. The human toll numbered 56 officers and men killed, 30 wounded.
Most of them, they were putting a mattress cover with a 5-inch projectile, put them between the legs, sew it up, put them on a plank under a flag, say the words and commit them to the deep, and they were gone. With the Army and stuff, they go over there and they dig them up and everything, but there was no digging up. Once you went down that plank, that was it. You went to the bottom. That's when I really started to realize that I wasn't bulletproof. You know, when you're 17, you don't think that anything can hurt you. It always happens to some other guy.
You can be so dang scared at sometimes, and yet when these things are happening, you can just snap back at it just like you can't believe it. You recover quick, because you got to defend yourself.
The Franklin's short combat record was impressive. At less than 6 months, from 4 July through November 1944, Franklin steamed 90,000 miles and earned 4 battle stars. Carrier Air Group 13 sank or damaged 155,000 tons of merchant shipping. 35 enemy men of war were damaged or sunk, totaling 300,000 tons. And the Franklin destroyed or damaged more than 338 enemy aircraft. Emerging from repairs and upgrades in early March 1945, the Franklin received a new air group, Carrier Air Group 5, consisting of Grumman Avenger torpedo bombers, Curtiss SB-2C Helldiver dive bombers, and for fleet protection, the Grumman F-6F Hellcats were replaced by the faster chance-fought F-4U-1D Corsair. Augmenting the Navy squadrons aboard Franklin were 2 Marine Corsair fighter bomber squadrons, VMF 452 and Pappy Boyington's former and famous Black Sheep Squadron, VMF 214. The principal change to impact the crew, however, came in the form of a new commanding officer, Captain Leslie Edward Garries. He'd assumed command at Ulithi the previous November. Physically a big man, he would make his presence felt immediately.
I had about 15 commanding officers in the military, and I had some real good stern ones, which that doesn't bother me a bit, you know. He don't have to talk to me. He tells me what he wants, I do the job, you know. I worked for 3 admirals, staff photographer for him. But Garris was not a commanding officer, he was a bully. I know more than you do. And his motto was, I'm a very big man. I take up a lot of space, don't get in my way. That's not a commanding officer.
Alienating the men from the day he took command, Garries chartered himself a collision course with most of the Franklin's crew.
He was a martinet. Captain Leslie Garries, G-E-H-R-E-S, turned the crew out in their white uniforms at Ulithi in the middle of the damn war, and nobody aboard ship wore whites at that time. We all were in dungarees. He berated the crew and told us we were malingerers and we weren't any good, and if the gunners had been any damn good, they would have shot down the plane. He was a Mustang too, an enlisted man that comes through the ranks. Garries was a captain, which is like God on ship, but he just did not have any empathy for the men.
He actually said that the plane hit us because We were lousy gunners. I don't know if he ever realized how ridiculous a statement that was to me. He was always looking to take a shot at Shoemaker. As you can tell, I didn't like the man very much, let's put it that way. From his opening speech, he thought that Leslie Gears was probably the greatest thing put here on earth, and that we should all be very, very grateful to have his services. We all thought that we'd be a hell of a lot better off without him, and that we had good reason for it. Later on, we found out just how bad he could really be.
He said, you're incompetent, you're lazy, you're careless, and I'm going to do my best to shape up this crew. Now, here are these men who, just a few days before this, they buried 56 of their shipmates. And the implication of what he was saying, you know, there wasn't any dummy on that ship at that time. They were all salted veterans. They had been in battles, they had been in typhoons, they had dodged torpedoes, they had been hit by bombs, and they had been hit by a kamikaze. And what I was told was that here are these men listening to their own brand new skipper, basically accusing the crew of incompetence, and it was their fault that their buddies had died.
Also joining the Franklin after repairs at Bremerton was a 39-year-old Jesuit priest and mathematics professor from the College of the Holy Cross in Worcester, Massachusetts. Father Joe O'Callahan also held an honorary degree from Georgetown University. He'd entered the Navy in 1940 and served in the Mediterranean theater aboard the aircraft carrier USS Ranger. Father Joe was well liked by the men who considered him a natural leader. 17 March 1945 was a Sunday, and Father O'Callahan conducted a church service on the forecastle deck. Men were in the open air, sitting on the anchor chains. At the end of the Mass, Father O'Callahan said, "We're going into the battle zone, men, and some of you will not survive."
One of the fellows in the chow line was talking about the ship's number being 13, which was unlucky, and we lost something like 13 pilots in exercise, and a whole bunch of 13s came in there. We're going to be lucky, he said, if we make it back to the States, not knowing what was going to happen.
We left Ulithi, and we're going up there, and there's 6 aircraft carriers, and we're all going to flank speed, and I looked out, and I see the whalebone in front of their bows, you know, we're heading towards Japan, and I said, where are those Japs now? We're really going to kill them. I knew we were going into harm's way, and each division would come up on the flight deck, and the officer would go down and you check your dog tags and make sure you had your dog tags on. I said, we're really going into something now.
Now, we got into the area near Japan on the night of March the 17th, St. Patty's Day, and the Japanese knew we were there. They came over and lit up the sky with flares, probably a 30-mile radius, and just lit this. It was like downtown Times Square type of deal. And the aircraft carrier were not allowed to fire for the simple reason that all of our guns were on the perimeter of the flight deck, and they would absolutely put up a very definite target for the Japanese.
Over the next 2 days, Franklin's crew would go to battle stations 12 times. As the fleet and Franklin's air groups pounded Japanese airfields on the mainland, the Japanese, in turn, struck out for the fleet with special, deadly emphasis on the carriers. On 18 March, a Dud bomb struck USS Enterprise. USS Intrepid downed a Betty bomber whose bomb load missed that carrier by just a few yards. A Judy dive bomber targeted USS Yorktown, its 550-pound bomb blowing holes in her hull. The next day, 19 March 1945, it would be Franklin's turn. As Franklin began launching her morning strike packages against Kobe Harbor, Captain Garys secured from General Quarters and placed the crew on a modified Condition 3, which allowed his exhausted crew a chance to eat a hot breakfast.
We apparently were at a position where they felt that we could relieve a portion of the gun crew to go have a bite to eat. I'll lay in my bunk for a few minutes and I'll go to chow later.
At 0654, Combat Information Center, or the CIC, reported a bogey 30 miles distant. At 0657, CIC reported bogey bearing 290 degrees, 24 miles distant and closing.
We're at the same sea condition as if we were cruising off San Diego, as far as a dogging down the doors, you know, and so forth. And of course, any thinking person would know that would be a big mistake.
Over the next 11 minutes, Franklin received 3 more warnings of multiple bogeys closing on her. But for reasons unknown, Captain Garys chose not to call the crew to General Quarters.
We couldn't figure it out. People down in the boiler rooms even mentioned, they said, why did we go in Condition 3? We're 50, 60 miles off of Japan. They can come out and attack us in a Piper Cub for crying out loud.
Finally, CIC reported a bogey closing from 270 degrees, distance 12 miles.
12 miles out. They come in 300 miles an hour. How long does it take to cover 12 miles? It's like nothing.
Captain Garys at that moment called the fire control officer and alerted him to fire on any unidentified aircraft without further orders. But he still neglected to call his crew to battle stations or General Quarters. 30 seconds later, the Hancock radioed Franklin in the clear. Bogey 350, distance 10. According to Captain Garys, this message was never transmitted to the bridge. In these final tense moments, 31 fully fueled and armed aircraft idled on Franklin's flight deck awaiting takeoff. Many were loaded with 500-pound and 250-pound bombs and the new 1,200-pound Tiny Tim aerial rocket. Another 21 aircraft were scattered below on the hangar deck in various stages of pre-flight readiness. At 8 minutes past 7, USS Hancock, sailing 1,000 yards off Franklin's port beam, radioed a final urgent 3-word message to Franklin. Bogey closing in.
I didn't have any idea there was anything going on. Everything was normal. It hit. You don't really, it was like, what the heck happened?
Table went up, the chairs went up, and everything fell flat on the deck.
And the explosion blew me right up against the overhead.
I was blown out of my bunk, and I started up the ladder toward the gun, which is shut above us, and fire coming down the ladder, so there was no way for me to go.
There was some pressure wave. Of course, it was a noise. The sound was the big thing.
I heard a banging sound, and I looked up. Something came through the overhead. I don't know what it was, but it blew up. Fell in front of me. By that time, it turned around. He got a belly full of shrapnel.
The explosions just kept going on and on and on, and we didn't know really what was happening up above at all. And we didn't know whether the ship was going to sink or what.
All hell broke loose. There was a fire station there, fire hose, and a gear with a wheel on it. I turned the gear and I threw the hose out the porthole. Nada, zip, no water. I realized then, I think, that the water mains on the ship, or whatever they call them, had broken.
We took off running aft. We got back 3 or 4 compartments toward the stern, and there was a rocket had come down from the flight deck down through the hangar deck and exploded between the 3rd and 4th deck. When we got near that, it was burning a fire there,
So we turned around and ran back to the compartment where we were having breakfast, and we started to go forward, and they said, no, there's fire forward, we can't go there.
I was running along, and this fellow was with me, and he said, I'm not staying down here, I'm going topside. And he ran right up the ladder, and there was a flash, and he just disappeared. He was there, and he was gone. And I was running forward in this passageway, and the guy was running right behind me, and there was another explosion. And I looked back, and there was a hole in the deck where he was. You know, it's that fast.
The bomb, with its delayed fuse, bored through the plank, punched through the Admiral's galley and the gallery deck, and hit the armored hangar deck. Hardened steel armor prevented further penetration, and the bomb ricocheted upward. And while that bomb was in midair, it exploded adjacent to the deck edge elevator next to a fully fueled Corsair parked on the hangar deck and loaded with a Tiny Tim rocket. The scene was catastrophic. It's estimated that as many as 400 sailors and Marines, standing in lines on the hangar deck for morning chow, were killed instantly. The gallery deck, where dozens of aviators were waiting in ready rooms preparing for missions, was smashed up flat against the flight deck. Within seconds of that bomb's explosion, gasoline vapors from ruptured refueling lines and torn aircraft fuel tanks accumulated in the hangar. And suddenly, the volatile vapor exploded throughout the length of the hangar deck.
Within a minute, the fire was totally around that area in that turret. This is a boxed-in turret, and there's a hatch. It was at the point where we could get out of that hatch, the man that was on the inside of that turret, and go overboard. If we'd have tried to go anywhere else, the flames would have got us.
When you couldn't breathe, why, it was time to go. And I opened that door, and there was nothing but explosions and fire and smoke. And Nick, he only been on the ship a month. He came on board in Pearl Harbor. So I told him to get behind me, hang onto my belt, and I gave him my life jacket. He didn't have a life jacket. We went up to the bridge, and there wasn't much room to stand around there, so he snuck into the captain's cabin, and I stayed in the back part of the bridge trying to keep out of the way. And the officers up there were running around in circles trying to figure out what to do, but nobody had any answers, really. The captain was racing around like a cat chasing a mouse. Then he went into his compartment. He picked up his wife's picture, and he's hugging his wife's picture. And he did that twice. And then he came back and he shouted orders to somebody, but didn't amount to much. They couldn't do anything. There was very little communication with the rest of the ship.
When I was aboard ship, I always had a certain amount of anxiety. It's an aircraft carrier. It's at war. I always had apprehension and knew what could happen if you got a bomb. And on an aircraft carrier, the most dangerous damn ship in the world, most vulnerable. But when the actual event happened, I was not scared. I don't know, I was just trying to save my fanny and too busy trying to figure things out.
On March 19th, 1945, a typical March winter in northern Japan, several crewmen told me that it was spitting snow that morning. And the air temperature was cold. They said the water was colder. And no one wanted to go in the water unless they absolutely had to. Of course, you have 90 feet from the flight deck to the water, so that's a pretty good jump. Bear in mind there was 150,000 pounds, I believe, of 100-octane avgas loaded on the flight deck aboard all the aircraft that were warming up. When that fuel went, and it was just rivers of flaming fuel everywhere. One man described to me, he looked into the hangar deck from his damage control station, and he said the fire was alive. He said you can't appreciate 100 octane fuel burning in that magnitude, that huge, huge, massive fire and flame. He says, you can't appreciate it unless you see it.
As men fought the fire topside, other dramas were unfolding below decks.
I just gathered myself up and went aft on the third deck. Then I went up to the second deck. And I was there, I don't know how long, it seemed like forever, but possibly 3 hours in a compartment with probably 100 other men. And of course, eventually, after a period of time, smoke got to be very thick, very heavy. I used my t-shirt tail and my own private little water source and breathed through that.
It was very hard to get your breath, and several of the shipmates took off their t-shirts and folded them up and urinated in them, and then turned the t-shirts around and breathed through it to filter out the smoke that would get down into and the fire get down into their lungs. I started saying the 23rd Psalm, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." And I didn't know all of it, so the others chimed in. Between the rest of the shipmates that were confined in that area, and we got the whole thing out.
We got into the messing compartment, and there was a whole bunch of us in there. We sealed up, dogged the doors down on either side, and we were just sitting there, and there was a hole about this big where they unscrewed it, and there was an air hole out there, and that's what we breathed through. And there's a doctor in there, he said, if you want to pray, don't pray out loud. You use up oxygen that way, just pray to yourself.
There was one guy that I remember over on the other side of the compartment that started screaming, "We'll all be killed, we'll all be killed."
Well, there was a lot of praying going on. There was several people that were kind of screaming, and people were trying to calm them down, and it was mass confusion. Lieutenant Gary came down, and he found us down there, and he found a way for us to get out. You grabbed the guy's belt in front of you, and he grabbed your belt, and you formed like a chain getting out through the smoke and everything. And he went out, and he went down, and he knew the ship like the back of his hand. And we got into the uptakes, and there was a ladder there, and we went up the uptakes and got up on the flight deck.
Everybody wants to head for the doors, and they're excited, you know, jumping around and whatnot. I told them that I'm going to try to find an exit, and if I find one, I'll be back. I came back, so I explained to them that if we all hold on to one another's belts and don't rush at all, don't push, we can maneuver out slowly. This is when I push my strength to yell to the crew members that you better listen to what's happening, because we won't make it. And they did, they listened. To this day, it amazed me how a 17-year-old kid can control a crowd this large. Now, in the other mess hall, there was a lieutenant, I think he was a full lieutenant, that led out a crew of sailors and did the same thing. I'd like to add at this point, the lieutenant received a Medal of Honor. I received a Navy Cross, and that's one thing I can understand to this day.
During the next 5 hours after the initial enemy bomb impact, it's estimated that more than 50 of the 66 500-pound bombs loaded on the Franklin's flight deck exploded. Among the most deadly hazards on that flight deck were 1,200-pound Tiny Tim aerial rockets. These high-explosive missiles were touched off by burning fuel and roared off in every direction.
I was standing in, this big thing went flying by. So I said, "What was that?" And they said, "It's a Tiny Tim." I said, "It ain't a tiny anything."
Franklin's executive officer, Commander Joe Taylor, watched the scene unfold on the flight deck. Sailors, Marines, and aviators Some without firefighting training ran headlong into the smoke and fires with hoses to save the ship. Taylor would later write, "Their heroism was the greatest thing I've ever seen. They simply would not leave their hoses in spite of what appeared to be certain death and disaster."
This fellow was behind me, and we were fighting the fire, and he said, "I'm going over the side, the ship's going down." I said, "The flag's still flying." I knew they'd strike the colors before they abandoned ship. So we're fighting the fire, and there was an explosion, and men went flying up in the air and everything. And all of a sudden, I couldn't hold the hose anymore, and it was snaking on me, so I fell on the hose, and I turned around, and I said, "You son of a bitch." And he ran right off the end of the flight deck. You ever see anybody riding a bicycle with no bicycle underneath of him? He never stopped running. He ran right into the air, and I saw his waist and his shoulders and his head, and he just disappeared, you know.
I remember being on a 2.5-inch fire hose with a big Marine. All of a sudden, the ready service room blew up right in front of us, and we turned and dropped the hose and turned and ran, and a big chunk of metal came down over my shoulder, and I stopped, and I looked over to the side, and there was a helmet. I ran over and I grabbed the helmet and put it on, and then kept running. Not that it would have done any good had it hit me.
Some of these guys really panicked, and they're just running nowhere. Some of them were running toward the fire. This guy come running out of the fire, and I said to somebody else, "Hey, slow down," or something. I reached out and grabbed him by the arm. And he kept going. I still had the arm. He was so thoroughly cooked that it just came off like a chicken leg. It didn't bother me at the time. I just took him through the thing over the side. I guess there's a couple of different kinds of shock that can set in. And I happened to get the good one. I got the one where I wasn't afraid. It was a real horror show because these people trying to get out, and they couldn't see where they were going. You got planes with props churning out there. You had to be there to really appreciate it. Like I've said to people, I could sit there and explain it to you, but if you can't hear it and you can't smell it, then you lose most of it. You can't really imagine exactly what it was like.
I'm up on the flight deck. It was chaotic. A propeller off one of the planes, a 3-bladed propeller, flew through the air, hit the #1 mount, and sat like a top, spinning. It was just like a sickle or a sigh, those blades spinning around. And the gasoline was just pouring off the flight deck like a fountain of gasoline. And I dropped into the water, which was a very bad move.
There was a huge explosion and floating through the air up there. It was the first time I ever flew. There was 3 of us, and we were together all the way up and all the way down till he hit the water. That was like hitting concrete. I told the guy, because he had a helmet on, and I told him, I said, "Unbuckle that thing." You're taught that if you hit the water and you've got that thing buckled, it's like getting hung, it'll break your neck. I went down deep enough to get turned around by the screws, so the engines were still running when I went off, because the screws were turning and we're going around and around and around down there. Then you can't swim up because you don't know where up is. You might be swimming the wrong way, and you've only, so you just sit there and wait and say, "Hope I got enough breath for this." And all of a sudden you pop up. Or you don't pop up.
One of the first ships to dramatically come alongside the Franklin was the light cruiser USS Santa Fe at about 0930. The Santa Fe's skipper made a gutsy move and turned his ship right into the Franklin. They quickly became locked together, and it was then that the men on the escort ship saw the carnage firsthand. Aboard Santa Fe that morning was a gutsy 22-year-old photographer, photographer's mate first class Al Bullock. Bullock's dramatic images and film footage would go on to be ranked among the best and most historic combat imagery in all of World War II.
When I first got this camera, I had experience on how to operate it, but now I got one. And so one of the first shots I get is the carrier. Well, I was shooting with a normal lens, and I could see them pretty good. And of course, with the moving ship and stuff like that, you could handle it. But then I thought, I'll go to telephoto lens. And so I pull it over to where it would be. And when I'm looking through this thing, it's like looking down a tunnel. And I said, oh, he's got to be out there someplace. And I'm like this, but the camera's rolling. When I went aboard the carrier to take pictures, and I heard him say, 2 or 3 guys, let's get off this goddamn thing. It's sinking.
The scene on the Franklin's flight deck was chaos and horror. Dozens of men huddled together on the bow, terrified, unsure of where to go or what to do. And sailors continued to die.
In interviewing the Franklin crew, one thing that kept popping up, especially the guys on the flight deck, was, well, I saw Father O'Callahan doing this, or I saw Father O'Callahan doing that. Father O'Callahan asked me to help throw overboard unexploded bombs. Father O'Callahan told me to grab this fire hose and put out this fire. He seemed to be, as one Franklin crewman put it, everywhere at the same time. It was just phenomenal. What he did was he took a shell-shocked crew and he organized them, and they became effective.
Well, Bob Blanchard, he didn't know why the chaplain had his hands on his shoulder. And I said, because he was holding you down, you wanted to get up. And so he said, well, I didn't want to be transferred over to that ship on the basket, because if the ship banged together, they'd never find him. He was truthfully there.
It's a moment that Robert Blanchard, to whom Chaplain O'Callahan gave the last rites, will never forget.
I knew the situation, but I didn't realize it was that bad. You know, I didn't realize I was in such bad shape. I knew I wasn't good, but I didn't think I was in that bad shape, but I really was. Yeah, after a while, I realized, gee, wow. I went through quite a bit.
By 0945, the Franklin began to list heavily to starboard from the almost 3,000 tons of firefighting water which had accumulated below decks. By 1000 that morning, the Franklin was dead in the water, burning, drifting ever closer to Japan. Admiral Davidson had long since transferred his flag to the Hancock. Before his departure, the Admiral informed Captain Garries he thought there was no hope of saving the carrier. At the time, Garries didn't respond to Davidson, but in an interview years after the war, Garries said he thought it was none of the Admiral's damn business, and that with men still trapped below decks, abandoning a Franklin would mean certain death for hundreds of his crewmen. By midday, Admiral Davidson ordered the USS Pittsburgh to take the Franklin in tow. As weary Franklin crewmen worked to secure the tow line, exhaustion overtook them. It was only when the black steward's mates on board the Franklin joined in with a chorus of heave-ho that the two lines started moving. Executive Officer Joe Taylor later said that the black crewmen, all working together and singing, were the men who finally brought the tow lines over. With Franklin under tow by the Pittsburgh at 2 knots toward Ulithi, rescue efforts continued.
Once the Franklin was hit, all orders throughout the fleet was for all the strike aircraft to return from Japan, and the fleet was formed basically to save Franklin.
Finally, you start seeing destroyers coming up and trying to pick up men. Right alongside of it, and they had a net, and just not hardly enough strength to get yourself. They helping you get aboard. The strength was gone. I spent 5 hours and 25 minutes in the water.
A lot of them couldn't swim, but there was debris in the water, there was rafts in the water, what they call Carlin floats, which were like a big pallet with padding around it.
A lot of them were going from exposure and stuff. Somebody would say, oh, it's getting warm. And usually after they said that, if you looked for them a couple of minutes later, they were gone. They'd go to sleep and go under. It was cold. It was really cold.
As the sun set on 19 March, explosions reduced in frequency and the fires finally calmed. By 22:30 that night, a damage control party broke through to relight Franklin's No. 5 boiler.
That night, this officer said they need to be relieved on the hose back there. They're up on the flight deck. And he said, we've got to keep the fires down because the Japanese fly over and they see that flame, it'll be like a beacon for them. So I'm manning the hose back there, and there's a fire that's burning back there, but I couldn't actually get the hose on it. But all of a sudden I saw this object that was hanging down there, and I sprayed on this object, and the water would splash up under the fire in the back there. Well, the sun came up in the morning, and it was a body that was hanging down. So, I guess he helped save the Franklin too. I'm sorry.
By dawn the next morning, 20 March 1945, the Pittsburgh had towed Franklin 85 miles away from Japan. And by 1100, with boilers relit, Franklin was plowing forward at 14 knots. Gary's requested permission to cast off the tow line. Admiral Davidson granted his request. Unbelievably, Big Ben was sailing once again and under her own power. But by 1430, several bogies put in an appearance. At this time, the USS Alaska picked up a Japanese plane 52 miles north and closed it. A second one was reported 6 minutes later. The task force's combat air patrol was dispatched to intercept, but a Japanese D-4Y Judy dive bomber once again snuck through. That plane, coming out of the sun and difficult to see, was not positively identified until it actually dove toward the Franklin.
Archie Wilson pointed up and hollered, there he is, there he is. And of course we looked up and I was trying to train the gun mount, and we were on a list, 13-degree list, something like that, and it was very hard to train the gun uphill.
And also these puffs of smoke going up in the air, and here's an airplane flying right over the Alaska, right? I said, my God, they're coming for us again.
About the time that we opened fire, I saw the nose of the plane rise up a little bit when he let his bomb go, and the bomb went right over the port stern. That was why we were credited with saving the ship.
The carrier was spared what would have certainly been a mortal blow. But as crewmen of the Franklin breathed a sigh of relief and concluded one of the most successful naval rescue operations of all time, a new and strange drama was about to unfold, which, even by modern standards, is difficult to fathom. Captain Garys ordered the return of roughly 100 officers and petty officers who he deemed essential to bring Franklin back to port. But once they boarded the carrier, they were each handed a letter. That letter read, "The commanding officer requires an immediate explanation in writing as to when, where, and why you, able-bodied and uninjured, left this vessel while she was in action and seriously damaged when no order had been issued to abandon ship." Franklin's crewmen, many with decades of experience and most with 3 years of war behind them, were shocked and bewildered. Their own skipper was accusing them of abandoning ship without cause. The rest of the Franklin crew aboard the cruisers and destroyers had already heard the rumblings that Captain Gary's planned to charge them with desertion. This news spread through the fleet as fast as the fires had swept through Franklin's hangar deck the previous morning. Additionally, the accusation angered thousands of fellow sailors in the fleet who'd witnessed the catastrophe. The Japanese made one last attempt to target the fleet. On the morning of 21 March, a Japanese reconnaissance aircraft spotted Big Ben in the fleet 325 miles from Kyushu, Japan. 48 Japanese aircraft were launched, including for the first time 18 Japanese Betty bombers configured with the new kamikaze rocket, the Oka, or Cherry Blossom. It's known among the Allies as the Baka bomb, or the Fool. The rocket was essentially a flying warhead. Traveling at speeds of more than 500 knots, the Baka was a serious and deadly threat to the American fleet. Here's the actual gun camera footage as Hellcat fighters from Hornet and Belleau Wood decimated that Japanese strike force. None of the Bakas reached their intended targets. None of the American ships were damaged, and none of those Bettys returned to Japan. The Franklin and her remaining crew were finally, fully out of harm's way. That afternoon, Captain Gary's completed the first formal muster of his crew since the strike. He counted 704 officers and men. 2 days later, just prior to arrival at Ulithi, Captain Gary's created the Big Ben 704 Club, representing the 704 men who mustered on 21 March. The requirement for the 704 Club membership was that the sailor did not leave the Franklin during or after the attack on 19 March. Now, with a divided crew, the remaining men aboard the Franklin began the heartbreaking task of burying hundreds of their fellow shipmates. But owing to the large number of dead and limited resources, the Franklin's crew could not conduct normal burial at sea services.
It was horrible. Because the men that were killed by that first blast were laying in 2 rows from the hatch going down to the mess decks.
All those burned bodies, and they picked them up in GI cans, a lot of them, you know, they were burned so bad. And I walked in that Marine locker, and they had the fire in there and everything. The guys were just dead in their bunks. They never knew what hit them. And I walked across the deck, and my feet slipped on the deck because just like you roast something, you know, the grease comes out of their body, and it was on the deck. Yeah.
It was quite a ceremony. It was kind of get to you, you know what I mean? It's a personal thing, but then all of a sudden, you know, a lot of them gone and you're still there, so.
I guess I'd been aboard probably a month, and I had been told to go to a storage area under one of the aircraft elevators to pick up something and bring back to the fire room. And while in the storage area, I saw a line of probably 20 or 25 scoop shovels. And I thought, well, why would you have a scoop shovel aboard an aircraft carrier? You use scoop shovels on the farm to handle grain. But after March the 19th, I found out what scoop shovels were used for aboard an aircraft carrier that had been blown up and burned up. That's the way we picked up body parts and things like that.
In all, 479 men were recovered and committed to the deep. The seaborne trail of tears stretched for miles.
Dead bodies being thrown off the ship, and there was a guy standing along the rail of the Santa Fe, and they was identifying our buddies as they float and roll up on their faces. Oh, that's Pete, that's Joe, that's Mac, or whatever. They were picking out their friends as they floated by the ship, by the Santa Fe.
At Ulithi, a memorial service was conducted on Franklin's flight deck. Crewmen who were not aboard the Franklin prior to her arrival in port were not allowed to attend the ceremony. Those crewmen who were not members of Captain Gary's 704 Club were transported like outcasts to Hawaii aboard naval or Coast Guard receiving ships. On 3 April 1945, Franklin entered Pearl Harbor. Welcoming the ship were scores of dignitaries and senior officers who'd heard about the Franklin. Also there to greet the ship was a contingent of U.S. Navy waves.
I can remember the people standing on the dock when we came in, and they were singing, and when they actually saw the ship up close, their mouths dropped open and there wasn't any singing from that point on. It was a group of waves that they had come down to the docks to see what it looked like, and they were horrified.
Tragically, not all crewmen were welcomed back at Pearl Harbor. Hundreds of the carrier's crew, those not actually aboard Franklin, were stunned to learn that they would never again serve aboard Big Ben.
We was all allowed to come on and get our clothing, and he said, "Get the hell off my ship." And so we was on the ship about 10 minutes, and some of the guys probably seen their friends. And some of them told me, he said, "Well, they're back aboard." He said, "No, I'm not." He said, "Get my damn clothes and get off the ship."
We didn't have a chance to look it over or anything. They didn't let us have it. I don't think the ones that abandoned ship was too welcome back.
They wouldn't let us come back with a ship. They put us in Hawaii. I was out in Barbers Point, the Naval Air Station. And the first night, the guys we were in regular barracks, but I guess the nightmares and stuff had everybody going. There was guys wrapped up in mosquito net and falling out of the beds and stuff, and they were hollering and everything. So the next night, they put us in a place called Mongoose Manor, which is way up. They said, "Hey, do all the hollering you want. Nobody will hear you out here."
We was taken out in the middle of a cane field somewhere to a camp where they had some barracks. It was all wired in, high fences around it and that, and they kept us there for quite some long time. There was a rumor that we was all going to be charged with mutiny for going overboard. How true it is, I don't know, but that was a rumor. If it was true, I'd like to put one of them in my position or whole crew's position of being in that turret at fire and see whether it had been mutiny.
This is a saga that has never been addressed as far as the Franklin goes. These men in the water have been forgotten, just like they never existed. We went down to Ulithi, and Captain Garris brought 400 men back on the ship that he wanted to bring back on. And he formed what's called the 704 Club, but they didn't bring the ship out of action. Anyway, and the rest of them, he claimed were deserters.
They didn't desert. Where are they going to desert to? Japanese didn't want us on their beach. I'm sure hell I can go swim over there. So where do you desert to?
The Franklin, now a shell of her former self, was fast becoming more than simply a heavily crippled warship. For sailors in the Pacific theater, she became symbolic of American survival, grit, and true heroism. In her darkest hour, she remained afloat. No order was ever given to scuttle her, and the time had now come for a 12,000-mile victory lap. On 9 April 1945, Franklin set sail for New York and the Brooklyn Navy Yard. More than 200 select crewmen were added to the 704 already on board. These numbers brought the total Franklin crew sailing home to 962 officers and men. The voyage was monitored every mile of the way, from the Panama Canal, on around the coast of Florida, and up the eastern seaboard. On 28 April 1945, the carrier finally arrived at Gravesend Bay, New York.
The tugboats came out to meet us, and they were spraying red, white, and blue with the hoses all over the harbor and followed us all the way up and saw us into the Brooklyn Navy Yard. It was kind of interesting, you know.
The American public, under a news blackout regarding the Franklin, didn't learn of the ship's heroic saga until 2 weeks later, on 17 May.
I don't know who it was, but they stole a dog in Hawaii. And I think they stole him by putting him into the garbage can and bringing him by the quarterdeck. And we brought him back to Brooklyn. He brought a lot of joy to the boys, I'll tell you, you know.
Of course, New York treated us very nice. 3 or 4 of us went down to one of the theaters there in Brooklyn, and we watched a movie, and then Pathé News comes on, you know.
At 3 minutes before 7 on March 19th, less than 100 miles from Honshu.
And the story about the Franklin and so on and so forth. Well, they went through all these things, and you know, they showed the whole damn thing.
The fire raged as bombs, rockets, and small caliber ammunition continued to explode with increasing violence.
Well, I'll tell you, the 4 of us went out of that theater, we were shaking. We didn't realize how bad it was, you know?
Dozens of selfless heroes were born. The Franklin's crew was writing a magnificent page in the history book of naval disaster.
It was something to see, because we're seeing it from somebody else's viewpoint, you know. It was kind of terrifying to see it.
A ship that won't be sunk can't be sunk.
Six decades after the disaster, historians continuously update casualty figures. A recent count brings losses for the 19 March 1945 fire to 807 officers and men killed in action and 487 wounded in action. Casualties incurred during both Franklin cruises totaled 926 killed in action, the worst for any ship to remain afloat, and second only to that of the battleship USS Arizona, which rests at the bottom of Pearl Harbor. In solemn ceremony on her flight deck, more than 1,100 Purple Hearts were awarded to the Franklin crew. The sailors had become, and still remain, the most decorated crew in American naval history. 20 officers and men were awarded the Navy Cross. 23 Silver Stars were awarded, including one to civilian Donald Russell, the chance-fought Corsair representative. He was the only civilian in World War II to receive the Silver Star. Even as those ceremonies were concluding at New York, Captain Garys initiated court-martial proceedings against a select group of officers and charged them with several serious wartime crimes, including desertion.
Personally, I think Garys knew he made a mistake by putting everybody on normal cruising, and we wasn't defending the ship, and it looked pretty sticky.
The treatment of the Big Ben crewmen who are not part of the 704 Club is one of the greatest injustices in the history of the U.S. Navy. For the hundreds of sailors in Hawaii, a defense was established on several fronts.
Jeremy, remain your New York correspondent, Walter Winchell.
Some of those wet sailors, or those who were forced overboard during the attack, even contacted radio personality Walter Winchell to inform him of the unjust treatment by Captain Garys. In the end, all charges were dropped. Additionally, Father O'Callaghan was told he would be awarded the Medal of Honor for his heroic deeds. But then, the Navy's awards board denied him the medal. Perhaps because he wasn't a line officer, or perhaps because Captain Garys was not being recommended for the highest honor. No one knows for sure, but Father O'Callaghan's award was reduced to the Navy Cross. Knowing that he'd been recommended for the higher award, Father O'Callaghan refused to accept the Navy Cross, the only man in U.S. Navy history to do so. Washington reporter and muckraker Drew Pearson, who'd gained notoriety during the war for being the first to report the incident of General George Patton slapping a soldier, had heard of Captain Garys' vindictive treatment directly from many Franklin crewmen. Pearson wrote an article detailing the accounts of Garys leaving the ship wide open to attack, his subsequent treatment of the crew, and the Naval Awards Board's decision not to award Father O'Callaghan the Medal of Honor. Secretary of the Navy James V. Forrestal read Pearson's piece. Forrestal, a no-nonsense patriot far beyond Leslie Garys' political reach and the Navy's good old boy network, pushed the O'Callaghan medal through. Both Father Joe O'Callaghan and Lieutenant Donald Gary, no relation to the infamous skipper, were awarded their Medals of Honor by President Truman in a ceremony at the White House on 23 January 1946. Captain Garys received the Navy Cross, but he never again commanded a ship in the United States Navy.
They transferred him to San Diego, and that was the end of that. And that cost him the Congressional Medal of Honor, because he pushed that.
In the end, Franklin was rebuilt by the Navy.
You know, when I left that ship for the last time, and it put back just like it was, it took them a year to build it, and it took them a year to fix it, painted and everything. I could still smell burned flesh on that ship. It's amazing. I guess it must have impregnated right into the metal or something. But I could still smell it.
I'm very proud to have been on it and been a part of it, because I think it's history. And it was an experience that I wouldn't ever want to go through again, but I wouldn't take $1 million for my memories.
In 1952, Franklin was designated an attack carrier, or CVA-13. A year later, she was reconfigured as an anti-submarine carrier, or CVS-13. In 1964, Franklin was the first Essex-class carrier to be classified unfit for further service. She was mothballed. 2 years later, the ship was stricken from the Navy Registry and sold to Portsmouth Salvage Company for $228,000. She was cut up for scrap in 1969. Workers dismantling the ship at the time said they heard eerie voices and sounds below decks, like guys horsing around the way guys do. Many firmly believed the ship was haunted. Whether she was or not will forever remain a mystery. What's certain is that the fighting spirit of the men who proudly served aboard the Franklin is one thing that will never die.